I've learned so much as a line manager, which I'm going to take back to the workplace myself.
The information was amazing. So many people resonated, and there was actually a lot of functional information.
My favourite thing was the talks from Colin. I think he got the information across really accessibly, but also in a way that I felt was sympathetic to people with ADHD.
Loved hearing about the different lived experiences from Tom and from Demit. Both brought a completely different viewpoint across, so really fascinating to hear.
I wholeheartedly recommend it. 11 out of 10 or 100 out of 10.
I think they give you really practical takeaways and an opportunity to network with other people in this field in a safe environment.
This was really well thought through, brilliant speakers. People really need to check this stuff out.
Welcome to Skill Sessions. Lots of people joining. Thank you so much for joining us today. If it's your first time joining Skill Sessions, welcome, very welcome. This is an event series hosted by CareScribe. It's all designed to share knowledge around areas of neurodiversity and disability, and ultimately help build and foster an inclusive community where we can take specific topics based on this and discuss them. Each event is based on a different topic, and this month we've got Mark Woodward, Head of Occupational Delivery at Neurobox, joining us. So we're very excited to hear from Mark. It's so great to see so many people joining. This is fantastic. It's lovely to see so many of you here. So thank you very much for joining, and thanks for your support. I can see people are already familiar with the chat function, so that's brilliant. So please do use the chat in Zoom. Say hello, let us know where you're joining from. Make sure you set the chat setting to all, otherwise you're just talking to us as panelists. So yeah, please make sure you set it to all so you can speak to everyone. But yeah, it's been amazing to see this community grow over the last year, and the sort of the conversations that we have on these calls are fantastic. So yeah, please get involved as much as you can. Great. So whilst everyone's joining, and before we really kick things off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about CareScribe, just to tell you who we are and you know, why we run these sessions. So my name's Rich. I'm one of the founders and directors of CareScribe. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, we are one of the UK's leading assistive technology companies. We're based in Bristol. Myself and my other two founders, Chris and Tom, we're all neurodivergent, as are many of our team, and we spend every day working to support disabled and neurodivergent individuals to work and study more independently. And we do that by building technology. That's how we try and affect change. And we have a couple of software tools which you may have heard of or may even have used. One of them is called Captioned, and the other one is called TalkType. Captioned is a piece of captioning and note-taking software designed to help people better comprehend and retain some of the huge amounts of information that are thrown at us from lots of different directions in our busy day-to-day lives. This is, of course, of tremendous value to a wide range of people with a wide range of disabilities and neurodivergent profiles. From those who are maybe deaf and or have hearing loss and struggle to comprehend what's being said, to those like me who are dyslexic, have ADHD, ASD, who may have similar difficulties or find it hard to retain information and stay focused. So that's what Caption does. Really helps you to comprehend and retain some of that sort of that information and make some sense out of the noise in our busy lives. And the other piece of software is called TalkType, which is a dictation tool, which is helping people to convert their thoughts into text, something which I and a wide range of people find very challenging for a wide range of reasons. If you want to know any more about our assistive technology or CareScribe, feel free to pop a message in the chat, and we'll try and set up a demo for you. Also, you can add a request onto the feedback at the end, and we'll get in touch. Or there's also a great opportunity to see our software in action in a couple of weeks when my colleague Chris is going to be running a webinar called The Power of Assistive Technology, How Captioned and TalkType Can Support neurodivergent people and people at work. So if that sounds of interest, we'll ping you an email with some information about that, and you'd be welcome to join that webinar, which is focused specifically on the software. Great, still people joining. This is brilliant. As I say, keep the chat going. That's fantastic. Quick bit of housekeeping before we hand over to Mark and get things rolling. If you're not familiar with Zoom, captions are available. You can turn those on yourself. And again, make sure you're using the chat if you want to, and keep things moving and keep the conversation flowing. This is a very safe space, so yeah, there's no wrong questions. Make sure you ask. If you do find the chat distracting, you can turn that off yourself. If you've got some pertinent questions for myself or for Mark, if you can use the Q&A function of Zoom for that, pop your questions in there. We'll have some time at the end to answer those specific questions. And you can also, if you see someone else's question and think, oh, I want an answer to that, you can upvote it, and then we'll try and make sure we get to it. So either pop your question in there or upvote other people's questions, and we'll have some time at the end. We don't always get through all the questions at the end because we often get quite a lot. But if we don't get to your question, don't worry, we will get to it, and we'll send it in the post-event email. We'll send all the answers across. And yeah, no question's a wrong question. So yeah, please do ask. If you'd like a certificate of attendance, then after the webinar, we'll send a feedback form. If you fill that out, and in there, you can request a certificate. So please make sure you do that. And this session is being recorded, and you'll be sent that recording after the session in the post-event email, and there'll be a link on social media too. Brilliant. So final few bits from me before we hand over to Mark. We're going to be at the Dyslexia Show at the NEC at the end of next week. Gosh, that's crept up. So if you're there, then please come and see us. I know Neurobox are also there, so I don't know if Mark is planning to be there, but yeah, come and say hi. It's going to be a great event. And finally, another date for your diary. The next month's skill sessions is already being planned, and we're going to be covering uncovering even reasonable adjustments for neurodiversity in the workplace, and that's on Tuesday the 9th of April, but we'll send all this information over to you, so don't worry about it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our guest, Mark. As I say, Mark is the head of occupational delivery at Neurobox. He's for more than a decade, Mark's been working with organisations, managers, employees to support neurodiversity and disability, not just how to support individuals, but their managers and the organisations too. So he's going to share some of that knowledge and experience with us as we dive into all things access to work. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Rich. So I'm going to share my screen because, unsurprisingly, I've got some slides for people. So let me just click the right button there, and hopefully everyone can see a big blue slide now. Okay. I'm sure somebody will tell me if you can't. So thank you ever so much for joining us. It's really great to be able to talk to so many people, and a little bit scary as well. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a dive into this thing called access to work today. But before we do that, let me just tell you a little bit about myself and the organisation I work for. So as Rich said, I work for a company called Neurobox. Essentially, we support organisations to support their disabled and neuro-different people. And we do that in a number of different ways, at generally sort of three kinds of levels in an organisation. So at the top of an organisation, looking at policies and processes and things like that. On an individual level with employees, looking at workplace needs assessments, training, all that sort of stuff. But also crucially, sort of in the middle, working with line managers, helping the people on the front line of policies, if you like, to actually manage these situations and have these challenging types of conversations. So various different levels. Myself personally, as Rich said, I've been in this space now for more than a decade. In fact, actually, I think it's a little bit more than a decade, and I'm not even going to depress myself by working out the numbers, but for a while. And I've got a few different hats, and I work with organisations on all of those sorts of levels that we talked about before. And I will be at the Dyslexia Show as well. I've been roped into doing some speaking there too. So access to work, sometimes known as the government's best kept secret. Okay, we're going to have a go at sort of demystifying it a little bit today and just sort of answering some of the many, many questions that come up about access to work. Questions like, what is access to work? Is it for me? Does it cost anything? All these sorts of things. So we're going to go through this, ask a few questions as we go through. Any questions that you have that we don't answer during this or that we don't discuss, as Rich said, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to them. Okay, we're going to leave some time after this as well to go through some too. But let's kick off a little bit with access to work. So let's start with the basics. What actually is access to work? Access to work is a government scheme. It's a public funded grant, essentially to support organisations to support their disabled people and neurodivergent people in work, to stay in work, even to move into self-employment and start a business. That's something that we see quite a lot of, actually. One thing to just notice about this, though, is that access to work isn't there to help with business startup costs. It's to support an individual with their needs to start a business, if that makes sense. Access to work has been around for a while, since 1994. So I want to say, so about 10 years now. And if anybody tells me it's nearly 30 years, I'm just going to refuse to listen, all right? Because I'm not that old. It's administrated and managed by the Department for Work and Pensions via the Job Centre Plus network. And the idea of access to work is that it's to financially support the employee and the employer with some of the adjustments that people may need as a result of a disability. There's also another string to access to work as well, which is relatively recent, but there's a mental health support element to access to work as well. So if an individual is off work, sort of worried about losing their job, or just sort of struggling to cope, they do have some support mechanisms in place to help in that area as well. So access to work is a really great scheme. You may have heard lots of things about access to work, not all of them great. It takes a long time. There's lots of hoops to jump through, etc., etc. And to a degree, that's all relatively true. But at the same time, we are one of the very few countries in the world that has such a scheme, and we are really, really lucky to have it. And it works. It works really well when it works. So let's ask the first question that most people want to know is that, am I eligible? And the honest answer to that is usually yes. If you have a disability or a long-term health condition, which falls under the definition of disability, which we'll look at in a second, and you need adjustments, you are going to qualify for access to work. We also get asked sometimes, well, neurodiversity. Yeah, I'm dyslexic. I'm not disabled. Does it apply to me? And again, neurodifference almost always falls under the definition of disability. Okay, I'm speaking as someone who's dyslexic. I don't consider myself disabled. If I have forms to fill out with a tick box that says, do you have a disability? I never tick that box. I'm not disabled. I'm dyslexic. But that debate aside, under the terms of the Equality Act, I do meet the definition of disability as a neurodifferent person. And that definition of disability is if you have a physical or mental impairment, and I'm not sure what sort of impairment exists if it's not physical or mental, but anyway, if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities, then you are meeting the definition of disability. So neurodiversity falls within that definition. Okay, and what's really important to notice is that actually this goes for all disabilities, not just neurodifferences, but a formal diagnosis is not required to fall under the definition of disability. Okay, And that's something that comes up quite a lot. What does substantial mean? Substantial is an interesting one. I looked up one definition of substantial, and the definition I got back was not insubstantial, which was really helpful. It's a bit grey and fuzzy, and purposely so, but essentially it means more than trivial. Okay. Long term is easier to determine. Long term means 12 months. So if your illness, condition, neurodifference is lasted more than 12 months or likely to last more than 12 months, it meets this definition. And of course, with neurodiversity, neurodifferences, we're born with them. They are most definitely long term. Normal daily activities. Going to work is classed as a normal daily activity. Okay? So essentially what we're saying here is that anything that has an effect, a long-term negative effect on your ability to go to work, will class you as disabled. So things like dyslexia, ADHD, etc., will almost always meet the definition of disability under the Equality Act. So if you do meet that definition of disability, you will be eligible for access to work support. Like with all things in life, there is some small print, all right? And the small print around this isn't anything particularly onerous. So you need to be 16 or over, not unreasonable, unlikely that you're going to be in work if you're not 16 or over. You need to be in or about to start work, right? And this includes being self-employed as well. You need to be normally resident in England, Scotland, or Wales. Okay? People from other EU countries are eligible as well, as long as they've got work permits and so on and so forth. But normally you need to be living in the country. Some benefits can restrict the amount of access to work you may be eligible to. It's a bit of a moving thing, so it's something that I'm not going to pin figures on or anything here, but just be aware that there are certain benefits that can restrict the amount of access to work that you can get. Trainees, interns, apprentices are also eligible as long as they're part of a recognised scheme. Okay, and funding might be limited if you're regularly travelling outside of England, Scotland, and Wales. So the access to work is designed to support people within work within England, Scotland, and Wales. So if you're somebody that's regularly travelling to the States, for example, as part of your role, then your support is unlikely to extend to the time that you're abroad. And the final one is specifically for civil servants. If you're a civil servant, you do not qualify for access to work. Okay, there are some quite complicated legal reasons why that is, but that doesn't mean that support is not available for you. If you're a civil servant, support is still there. There are just different pathways to access that support. So that's the small print, and there's nothing in there that's particularly onerous or scary or unreasonable, I don't think. What type of support is available? The Equality Act says that if an employee has a disability, an organisation is obligated to make reasonable adjustments. Okay? And those adjustments can be absolutely anything, from flexibility around start times through to adjustments that cost money, for example, bits of software or equipment. Now, access to work is designed to help organisations with those adjustments that cost money. So the sorts of things that Access to Work are looking at funding are things like assistive technology, software, equipment, communication, support for interviews. So, for example, for someone who is perhaps deaf and they may need a sign language interpreter in an interview, for example, Access to Work will fund those sorts of things. Adaptations to premises or to vehicles, travel, either to work or in work. And that's something that we see quite a lot. And that is usually for people with sort of physical restrictions around travel, whether that be sort of musculoskeletal or whether it be sensory, like someone who's blind, for example. But it can also be there to support people with some neuro differences, like, for example, autism, who may find it extremely challenging to catch the rush hour tube train to get to work on time, for example. Access to work will fund alternative ways of travel. Support workers, again, a really, really great adjustment for some people. And support workers can mean all sorts of different things, from somebody who will sort of help with the, for example, the administration side of a person's role, all the way through to someone who may support with travel arrangements, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned before, the mental health support service as well, which is a really, really important add-on. So those are all the sorts of adjustments that we can be looking at with access to work. And that's just a few examples. There are many, many others. And access to work are quite good in that they don't necessarily have a defined catalogue of what they will and won't look at. In my experience, they're quite open to exploring different things. But as an organisation, how do we determine what is a reasonable adjustment? And one of the important things that I want to sort of mention with regards to access to work and reasonable adjustments is that access to work will advise an organisation on adjustments, but only really on adjustments for which they provide funding. There will be other adjustments that an organisation can make to support an individual that don't cost money or require funding. For example, as I mentioned before, maybe sort of flexibility around start-finish times, maybe an allowance to work from home a little bit more often, those sorts of things. Now, they don't require funding, so access to work are not going to advise you as an organisation that they could be considered. Okay, and just to confuse things a little bit, access to work call those types of adjustments, the ones for which they don't require funding, they call them reasonable adjustments. But in reality, any adjustment that is made is a reasonable adjustment. Okay. So I just want to sort of clarify that, because that's a misunderstanding that can come up quite frequently. But with regards to the word reasonable, if you are asked for an adjustment by an employee, whether that be for a piece of equipment or whether it may be to work from home a little bit longer than normal, how do you as an organisation work out whether that is a reasonable request or not? And the honest answer is it's really difficult, okay? And it's going to be different for different organisations and different roles. But there are a couple of questions that you can ask yourself that might sort of help clarify what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. And those questions are, first of all, how much of a difference is this adjustment actually going to make to this person? Is it the difference between just making one aspect of the job a little bit easier, or is it the difference between them being able to do their job or not? How important is this adjustment to them? Secondly, how practical is it going to be to put this into place? Is it going to mean a major reorganization, or is it just going to be slightly inconvenient? The third question is, how affordable is it? Not how much does it cost, how affordable is it? And that question, the threshold for that is obviously fairly low, because the chances are that access to work are going to provide some funding for it as well. And finally, the final question to ask is, will this adjustment affect other people's health and safety? Okay, health and safety overrules everything, all right? So those are 4 questions that an organisation can sort of explore to help them make a decision whether or not an adjustment may be reasonable or not. Hope that helps. Okay, another question that comes up quite a lot is, will I have to pay anything? Now, as an employee, the answer is almost always no. Okay, if you're an employee, if you're self-employed, if you need help in job interviews, you will not be asked to make any contribution whatsoever. And as I've put on this slide, the only exception to that is if you are going to gain some benefit from this adjustment outside of work. Okay. Personally, I don't think I've ever come across an instance of that, but it's there. So not unreasonable. So generally speaking, if you're an employee or self-employed, nope, you do not have to pay anything at all. What about employers? As an employer, will I have to pay anything? That's a little bit more complicated, okay? But there are some hard and fast rules. So first of all, if the employee is new, in other words, if they've been employed for less than 6 weeks when they apply, then as an employer, no, there is no contribution that you need to make whatsoever. It's entirely funded. Any adjustments that are recommended will be entirely funded. And there is no contribution at all for any of the mental health support services. Outside of that, so if the employee has been employed for more than 6 weeks when they apply, you will have to make a contribution as the employer. And that contribution varies depending on the size of your organization. Okay. Very, very basically, the larger the organization, the more you're expected to pay. If you're a relatively small organization, and that's classed as up to 49 employees, then you will be expected to pay the first 20% of anything that's recommended. Okay, so if there's a bit of software recommended for, say, £500, bit of equipment recommended for £1,000, that's £1,500. You'll be expected to pay 20% of that, which is £300. Access to work will pay the rest. And there is a ceiling. You won't be asked to pay any more than £10,000. Okay, sorry, 20% of £10,000 is the ceiling. If you're medium-sized, with 50 to 249 employees, it goes up to £500 plus the 20%. So the rules are still the same, but you'll also have to pay an additional £500. For larger employees, 250 plus, again, exactly the same, 20%, but you'll also be expected to contribute an additional £1,000. So the logic is that the larger the organization, the better the ability to make a contribution. So the greater the contribution is expected. That's essentially it. Okay. Now, how does this all work in practice? So let's take a story. How does access to work actually work in real life? So we're gonna give you a sort of an example. So I want you to meet Charlie. Charlie's just started a new role. Okay, now Charlie has suspected ADHD, but doesn't have a formal diagnosis. That's quite normal. As I said before, a formal diagnosis is not required. Okay, and there are many reasons for that, but you won't ever be asked to prove a disability. And that's really, really good because for certain, well, ADHD, okay, in my area of the country at the moment, the waiting list for an ADHD diagnosis is currently sitting at 5 years. Now, if I needed that formal diagnosis in order to get support in my job, I would either have to go and fund a private assessment, which, by the way, is still likely to take a couple of years, or I've got to wait 5 years. So essentially, I've got to survive 5 years without any support before I'm eligible. So it's a great thing that a formal diagnosis is not required. It can sometimes be concerning for organizations if a formal diagnosis is not required, because they will ask questions like reasonable questions, like, for example, well, how do I know what the disability is? How do I know if this person is dyslexic or if this person has ADHD, etc.? Okay. And I understand that question. But also at the same time, I would suggest also that actually the diagnosis, although really, really helpful, is not the most important part of this equation. If you have an employee that is struggling in their role or with certain aspects of the role, And there are some things that you can put in place to support that employee. Does it matter what the diagnosis is? Let's look at getting those adjustments in place. Okay, so a formal diagnosis is not required. Right. Let's say, for argument's sake, that Charlie is on the waiting list at the moment for a formal diagnosis, but at the moment there isn't one there, but she's starting this new role. Now, Charlie's concerned that their ADHD might affect them in that role, and they really, really want to do well in this job. Okay. But Charlie's new manager has done a great job at welcoming Charlie in and being supportive. And that's essentially meant that Charlie feels comfortable talking to their manager about their ADHD. Now, that's really, really important, because without that feeling of safety, of security, a new employee is naturally going to be reticent about stepping forward and saying, actually, I need some extra things. All right. It's much more likely that that employee is going to stay quiet and kind of see how things work out. Okay. At least until I know the organization better, I know my manager better, and I feel a little bit more comfortable talking about this stuff. So having that safe environment, having that sort of feeling of inclusivity, if you like, is a really, really important thing for organizations to cultivate. It means that people are more comfortable stepping forward earlier. And that means, I think, two really important things. One, it means that that employee gets their support earlier. It means that they're not going to wait for things to start going wrong before the reasons are looked at and support is put in place. It also means that if that employee applies for access to work within the first 6 weeks of their employment, as an organisation, you won't have to contribute anything to the funding. So that environment is really important. So good work to Charlie's manager. Okay. Now, Charlie's manager knows about access to work. So he signposts Charlie to access to work and explains to Charlie what access to work is all about and suggests that she apply. Now, again, this is an important point because an organisation can't apply for access to work. Even though the funding exists to help the organisation, the application process is owned by the employee. It's the employee that applies for access to work. And it's not difficult to do. There's a really great website. If you were to Google or type in access to work into your favorite search engine, the government, the access to work website is pretty much definitely going to be the first one on the page. And within that website, it's relatively straightforward. However, certainly with some neurodiversities, filling out forms, starting processes can be extremely difficult. And a person is likely to procrastinate a lot or begin the process and then be asked a question they don't have the answer for and go away and never come back. So it can be quite a daunting process for people to do. So as an organisation, as Charlie's manager, if you like, it can be a really great thing to actually support that employee through that journey, through that process. But let's say that Charlie's done this, Charlie's manager has helped through the process, and Charlie has made that initial application on the Access to Work website, which incidentally consists of filling out a relatively shortish form. The next step is that Access to Work will arrange a call with Charlie, a phone call, and it's essentially just to go through the form that Charlie's filled out online. So I can't get the words out today. Online, just to sort of clarify what's been put in the form, double check some information, and at that point, a date will be agreed for a proper workplace needs assessment. And that workplace needs assessment will be offered either via telephone, via Teams or Zoom, or in person. Okay. Traditionally, before the apocalypse, it was always in person. an access to work assessor will come out and visit you in your workplace and carry out this assessment. Nowadays, I think probably it's fair to say that the vast majority are carried out remotely or over the phone. So a date and a method for this assessment is agreed with Charlie. The next step is that the access to work assessment actually takes place. So in Charlie's case, it's over the telephone. What does an assessment look like? So assessments, access to work assessments, typically take around 30 minutes, around half an hour. Okay, there are going to be exceptions to that. Some will take longer and so on and so forth, but typically around half an hour. And the assessor is going to ask Charlie all about their role, what their role consists of, the sort of responsibilities and the duties within that role, even down to the depth of what type of applications and computer programs are you using for your role. They'll learn about Charlie's own strengths and challenges, and they'll build a really, really sort of detailed picture of what work at life looks like for Charlie. From that, the assessor will then go away and put together a report. And that report will detail everything that the assessor and Charlie spoke about, and it will make suggestions for adjustments that access to work are prepared to fund, and that the assessor believes will support Charlie in that role. Okay, and as I said, those sort of recommendations will look at all sorts of things that we spoke about before that access to work fund. Okay, so it might be pieces of equipment, maybe perhaps some furniture, sit-stand desk, for example, can be a really, really great adjustment for somebody with ADHD. It may be training, and that could be awareness training for Charlie's colleagues and manager to help them get a better understanding of Charlie's disability and neurodifference. It might be coaching. Coaching is a really important adjustment for people with neurodifferences. Coaching is where that employee will spend time with a coach that's also an expert in that particular disability or neurodifference. And that coach will work with Charlie to help develop ways of working, strategies to support Charlie in their role. The sorts of things that coaching cover can vary immensely depending on the individual and the role, etc., etc. Okay, workplace coaching is something I've done an awful lot of in my time. I'm actually a coaching supervisor these days. I've worked with people on all sorts of things, from very, very straightforward things like how do I manage the 300 emails I get every day, all the way through to had a really interesting one once, actually, which I don't mind sharing quickly. I worked with a library assistant who got coaching through Access to Work. And when we sat down and spoke with her and also her manager, one of the big difficulties that came forward was that this particular person was just not getting through their list of tasks each day. And this was because they spent way too long talking to the library users. And we had to explore that. And it turned out that the reason for this was that this particular person just found it very difficult to end conversations. People would come into the library looking for a conversation and a chat, and she would stand there for ages talking to them about everything, and she didn't want to be rude by saying that she had things to do. So part of their coaching was exploring that and developing strategies and methods for how to do that in a way that felt comfortable for them. So coaching can cover absolutely any aspect of a role, okay, which is why it's very difficult to explain exactly what coaching is, because it's very different. But it's a really important adjustment that Access to Work fund. Assistive technology, another really important thing. There are so many applications out there, and Rich mentioned a couple that CareScribe do. Really, really important applications that can support people in all sorts of different aspects of their role. And again, Access to Work will fund these as well. So this report will turn up a few days later. optimistically, hopefully, okay? And Charlie gets that report. That report goes to Charlie, not the employer. It's Charlie's report. And the other thing that this report will also do is that for every single recommendation, every single adjustment that it suggests, it will also point you toward an organisation that can provide that adjustment and an idea of the costing. The next thing that happens is that Charlie meets with her manager to go through this report. Okay. Now, in this case, the manager agrees to implement all of the suggestions that are in that report. But it's important to know that an organisation doesn't have to agree to implement all of those suggestions. They are suggestions. The decision as to whether or not a suggestion / adjustment is reasonable or not is always going to be down to the organisation. It's always the organisation's right to decide if something is reasonable or not. Now, that may well be tested at some other point, but it's not for Access to Work to say you've got to do this. It's always going to be the employer's choice. In this case, the manager agrees to implement all of the things that are in the report and also discusses with Charlie if there's anything else that the company can do to support. Another really important thing, because as I mentioned earlier, this Access to Work report is really only interested in the sorts of adjustments for which funding is available. Okay, things like starting a bit later, for example, flexible breaks and so on and so forth. Access to Work are typically not going to be interested in. That's up to you as an organisation to work out. So Charlie has that conversation with their manager as well, and they look at other areas of support. So the next step is to actually get this in place. Now, an organisation could go off to all the different suppliers that are listed in that Access to Work report. Okay, but in this case, Charlie's organisation decides to just go to one single organisation, okay, somebody like perhaps Neurobox, and source everything from one supplier. And there's many, many advantages for doing this, okay. One, if you're getting everything from one place, typically you're only going to have to deal with one invoice, one purchase order, admin costs and time goes right down. But also there's a really good chance that many of these organisations that have been recommended as suppliers, your organisation will never have worked with before. So there may be some hoops to jump through around creating new accounts and due diligence and all that sort of thing as well. Having one single supplier makes that process a lot easier. Also, from a logistical point of view, we've been asked as providers to deliver some training on a piece of software that's been recommended, but not the software. Okay, that's great. No problem at all. Happy to do that. We'll agree a training date. Fantastic. Our trainer will arrive all ready to do the training, to be told that, the software hasn't arrived yet. Again, all those sorts of things can be avoided if it's all coming from one supplier. All right. So many reasons for single sourcing all of this stuff. Another thing and again, this is something that we get asked to do an awful lot as a single source supplier is the support around this stuff. A lot of the assistive technology is going to be fairly new to organizations' IT departments. So very often there can be some teething issues around compatibility and installation and things like that. We've probably seen it all before, and again, we're there to support with all that side of things as well. So anyway, all the items are sourced. They're all sourced from this single source supplier, and it all turns up and is installed and implemented appropriately. Now, the organisation at this point has had to fund all of this. Okay, they've paid for everything up front so far. But now the organisation can claim back the funding from Access to Work. And they do this simply by submitting the invoices and receipts back to Access to Work. Up to probably a couple of years ago, this was a very manual process. It had to physically go through the physical post. Okay, there is now an online form that the invoices and receipts can be submitted through. And so this is done, again, a process that's much easier if you've got one receipt and invoice rather than dozens of them. But they are submitted up through, and the organisation receives the funding back from Access to Work that they're due. And as Charlie raised all this and applied early on in her employment, within the 6 weeks, actually all of the funding is done. Had it been a bit later than that, then they would have been granted the cost less their expected contribution. So that's the process of Access to Work, okay? It actually does work quite well. One of the biggest complaints we get about Access to Work is the time things take, and that is a difficulty. It's got a lot better, but it is one of the things that comes up. But as I said before, the process itself isn't too bad, and we are really, really lucky as a society to have such a thing as Access to Work. Okay. I'm just noticing the time. I've got till 1:50, I believe, haven't I? And I think we're just about there now. So I'm going to finish my slideshow there, and I'm going to hand back to Rich, and we'll sort of go through some. Well, we'll look at some of the questions and hopefully give you some answers. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen at that point.
Oh, cheers, Matt. Thank you so much. That was, yeah, that was fantastic. I knew there was going to be lots of interest because, well, when you have to upgrade your Zoom license, because so many people are signing up for the webinar, you know that it's going to be an interesting topic. And looking at the Q&A section, I think we were sort of 10 minutes in and already had sort of 10 questions. So we've got an awful lot of questions to get through. Just setting expectations, we won't get through them all. Please do upvote questions that you may want answers to, and we can try and get to those as a priority. And any questions we haven't answered, don't worry, we will answer them, and we'll ping over a long list of questions and answers in the follow-up email. So we'll get to everything. Yeah, really, really interesting questions. Let's see if we've got some answers. So Mark, the top of the list, upvoted quite a lot, is an employer legally obliged to make the adjustments recommended by Access to Work? Somebody's asked. Unfortunately, it's quite common for staff to get pushback from their managers.
Yeah, it is. And it's a good question. It's an important question. And the answer is that an organisation is legally obliged to make reasonable adjustments, okay? But they are allowed to determine what the word reasonable means for that organisation. That means that if they think a recommendation from Access to Work is unreasonable, they can choose not to implement it. That's their right. Now, that doesn't mean the organisation is correct, okay? But unfortunately, that's only ever going to be tested and challenged in a tribunal. Okay, that's the reality of it. There is unfortunately, there's no set bunch of rules that you can put an adjustment through that will tell you whether or not it's reasonable or not. It's always going to be a subjective decision. And it goes back to those 4 questions that I raised earlier on around what is reasonable. And this is one of the biggest sort of contentions. Now, I would suggest that if a professional needs assessor who spends their life doing needs assessments for Access to Work has made a suggestion, you would be a brave organisation to say that actually I know better and this is an unreasonable suggestion. You probably need very, very sound reasoning to argue that case, but it happens, all right? But in answer to your question, unfortunately, no, an organisation is not legally obligated to implement it just because Access to Work has suggested it. They can make a decision that it's an unreasonable adjustment, but at the same time, an employee has the right to challenge that decision in a tribunal.
Amazing, thank you, Mark. I mean, yeah, and there's often things that are Ursula actually raised in the Q&A section an interesting point, which there's things that also play into whether something is reasonable, such as from a software perspective, like information security, data protection, GDPR, all these things are like really important for, you know, from a security perspective in organizations, and it's going to be more and more so. So there's lots of right?
That's one of the reasons why the word reasonable is purposefully a little bit grey and fuzzy, because it has to be subjective and for that organization. With the best will in the world, a workplace needs assessor, and I'm speaking as a workplace needs assessor, we get a very small amount of time to have a snapshot of that organization. We can't possibly know the details of an IT infrastructure, of their GDPR policies. Okay, we will always make recommendations with a good heart. Okay, but we don't have the full picture, which is why it's important that an organization is allowed to make those decisions.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, thanks, Mark. Next question from Lizzie is: do you know what kind of things are available in the mental health support services kind of category?
A little bit, yes. I'm not an expert on this branch of Access to Work, I have to admit, but they do provide a certain number of talking therapy sessions. Okay. Again, most of the sessions and the support they provide tend to be online, sort of web-based support. But from my understanding, there is some proper talking therapy available. I don't know how much or how easy it is to access.
Well, thanks, Mark. There's a couple of bit of chat going on in the chat section as well. So hopefully, if people in the attendees know extra information, please pop it in.
It's not an area that I'm particularly well versed in on that side of things.
Fantastic. Next question is, and there's a couple of questions I think that link to this. Can somebody get help from Access to Work for interviews, for instance, if there's no employer yet? And I know there's a couple of questions around sort of the timing of when you can get Access to Work support, whether you've started employment or you're due to start. Yeah, do you know what the deal is there?
Yeah, good questions. Good questions. And yes, you can apply for support for interviews. That's absolutely quite normal and no problem whatsoever. In terms of beginning the application process before you start a job, again, that's relatively normal as long as you've got some proof that you've got a job, a letter of acceptance and so on and so forth, then again, no problem whatsoever.
Fantastic, thank you. An interesting question here that's been upvoted. So I've heard that applying for Access to Work, the Access to Work scheme can have negative ramifications later down the line. Is there anything we need to be aware of that could potentially be negative? That's quite an interesting.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I would be interested in understanding a little bit more about what those negative connotations may be. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other than the fact that asking for support in a particular organisation may be frowned upon, but that's more of an organisational thing than an Access to Work thing. But I can't think of anything specifically related to Access to Work that's going to come back and bite somebody. But I'm happy to sort of answer that again with a bit more information if that's okay.
I think that, yeah, as you say, it kind of comes down to organizational culture and psychological safety within the organization. I think more than anything, I'd be very surprised. And my understanding is that's a protected conversation with yourself and DWP as well from a needs assessment perspective. Probably the last question I think we will get in before we need to start to wrap things up. So if an employee's been given a piece of tech as part of their grant, what obligation does the company have to ensure it can be used on company laptops?
Yeah, again, really, really good question. Because there are compatibility issues and there are other issues that can render some software unreasonable adjustments. Okay, so as you sort of alluded to a moment ago, Rich, there may be some bits of software that breach a company's GDPR policies, for example. And again, it comes down to this question of reasonable. And that second question, if you like, how practical would it be to implement? Well, if it contravenes our policies and our GDPR policies, and those GDPR policies are reasonable, then it's an unreasonable adjustment. But what I would say is that it's highly unlikely that that's the only software option available, or even the only way of addressing that particular difficulty. Okay, just because one adjustment is impractical or unreasonable doesn't mean that we can't look at other options, if that makes sense. But just because Access to Work have recommended a specific piece of software, but we can't implement it on our systems, doesn't mean that that organisation has to make it work.
Brilliant. I'm going to squeeze in one last question because hopefully
make it an easy one, please.
Reasonably black and white, hopefully, and it came up a few times in the chat. Once you've put some equipment in place for Access to Work, whose property is it? Is it the employer or the employee?
Good question. Good question. Good question. Okay, so the software or the equipment, whatever it might be, belongs to the person that paid for it, and that's the organisation. Okay, the funding goes to the organisation. It's owned by the organisation. That said, okay, it's quite normal for organisations to just let you have the equipment if and when you leave or move jobs. Okay, certainly in the case of specialist chairs or furniture, that type of thing, and especially if it's at your home, they're unlikely to come out and collect it and take it back if no one else is ever going to use it. Software is a little bit different because there's quite a lot of licensing things to take into consideration about transferring licenses. But if you move jobs, you can apply for Access to Work again. Okay, so it's not that you're not going to get that software anymore. All right.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. That was a popular question in the chat. Well, look, I think it's time to wrap up. There is lots of questions unanswered. We will get back to them. And thank you so much to everybody for joining us, participating in the chat. And it's every time we do one of these sessions, it's fantastic to see the community that we're building. So thank you again to everybody for joining and being a part of that. And a big shout out to Mark. Thanks so much for joining us and imparting all that wisdom on Access to Work. It's as you can see, it's certainly been very, very popular, and lots of people have got a lot of value out of it. Just to mention, you will get the slide deck. We'll answer your questions. You will get a recording. We'll send all that across in emails, and there'll be also some stuff on social media that you can you'll be able to see. Certificates of attendance, again, just fill out that survey link at the end, the feedback link, and we'll get you a certificate to say that you were here. And if you want to hear about any of our software or CareScribe, then please, just request a demo. We'll be happy to oblige. We do these sessions regularly. We do them every month, and they're going from strength to strength. So if you do want to come and join us for our next session, it is a webinar, so it's online again. It's the 9th of April. We'll send you some details. We've got Helen Eaton, who's going to be joining us to cover reasonable adjustments for neurodiversity in the workplace. So that follows on really nicely from this session. So please do come along to that. And again, if you're at the Dyslexia show, come and say hi to myself and to Mark. We're both going to be there as well as our teams. So just to say thanks again for coming along. Thank you for participating and continuing to make these events what they are. So thanks so much, everybody. And hopefully see you next time.